Okay, good evening, Professor Paul Robbins, Professor Ian Baird, and everyone. My name is Liwa Phathai-song from the Department of Geography, Chiang Mai University. On behalf of the organizing committee, I would like to welcome you all to our second virtual geography speaker series. And this year-round seminar series aims to expand the horizons of geographical research in Thailand and are co-organized by the geography departments of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Chulalongkorn, Chiang Mai, and Naresuan universities, and the Geography Association of Thailand. First of all, please let me introduce you to Professor Ian Baird, who will be our moderator for today's session. Professor Ian Baird is a professor of geography, the director of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, and the coordinator of the Hmong Studies Consortium at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, USA. His interests include political geography, political ecology, Mekong River Basin hydropower dam development and fisheries, large-scale land concessions, indigeneity, and the histories of marginalized peoples in Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. So I will now hand it over to Professor Ian Baird to introduce you to the session.
Thank you, Dr. Liwa. So it's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Professor Paul Robbins, who is the director and the dean of the Nelson Institute of Environmental Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Professor Robbins received his bachelor's degree in anthropology at the University of Wisconsin in 1989. And then he went on and got a master's degree in geography at Clark University in the United States, and then completed his PhD also in geography in 1996 at Clark University. Since then, he's held a number of different positions. He was initially in the Department of Geography at the University of Iowa. He then moved on to be a professor at the Department of Geography at Ohio State University. And then he was a professor at the School of Geography and Development at the University of Arizona between 2005 and 2012. And since 2012 up to now, for the last almost 10 years, he's been the dean and director of the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. Paul Robbins is a very well-known and prolific scholar. He has written some important books, such as the book called Political Ecology, which is now on its third edition, that just came out in 2020. He also wrote an excellent book called Lawn People that was published by Temple University Press in 2007. He's also co-authored 3 different textbooks and 4 edited volumes, and has written a large number of academic journal articles that have been published in high-level geography journals over many years. I think the reason that I was particularly interested in inviting Professor Robbins to speak with us today is because he is really at the core of, I think, what geography is in this day and age. You know, very interested in interdisciplinarity, very interested in using mixed methods to do research. I mean, he's primarily a human geographer, but he works very well with people in the biological and physical sciences, as well as in the social sciences and humanities. So he's somebody who has really been at the core, I think, of what geography has been trying to do in recent years. And so I think he's a very appropriate person to speak for this speaker series. So without further ado, let me give it over to Paul to present to us his presentation today. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. I just dropped out. I don't know what happened to my internet. So if I disappear at some point, it will be a technical problem that I cannot control. Thank you to Ian. Thank you to my hosts in Thailand. Good evening to everyone. It is 6 a.m. here and I am ready to go. I am really pleased to be able to speak on the topic of geography. I'm the Dean of Environmental Studies here, which means I work with an interdisciplinary community, but I think there's no question that I would be in this position if geographers are naturally trained, if they're well trained, to speak multiple disciplinary languages, to operate in multiple methodologies, to be pliable to different epistemologies, different ways to also understand the community of science. And that has been training that I am grateful for, that I have spent the last, I don't know, many decades participating in. And I think it's that flexibility, that fluidity that has made my research possible. So I just want to say that I'm very pleased to be a geographer. Now I'm going to share my screen here. Hopefully this will do it. And provide you with a talk mostly about biodiversity. Can everybody hear me? Am I coming in okay?
Yes.
Okay. So the project I'm going to discuss is in South Asia. It's in India, southern India, in the state of Karnataka, and it's about biodiversity, which is a crisis. In North America, 1 million birds disappeared between 1970 and the present, which is 1/3 of the total bird population. About 1 million species worldwide are on the brink of extinction. Much of this is due to climate change, as we know, but a lot of it is due to human decisions in a specific way. And if we understand the biodiversity crisis to be one about decision-making, people producing landscapes, then we need to understand how people make decisions. So the research I'm going to describe today is very quantitative in the sense that we use fairly traditional metrics of biodiversity assessment, but also highly qualitative. What we learn and how we learn it about people's decision-making about the management of their landscapes involves lots of time spent essentially having conversations with producers, understanding how they value the land, understanding, oh, I've gotten ahead of myself, understanding how they make decisions. So what you'll see is a team effort of a large number of scholars who are trying to protect and maintain the native biodiversity of South Asia by coming to terms with how human the decisions are that govern that landscape. All right, so I'll get to it. Let's say I put you in a helicopter from the airport in Bengaluru in Karnataka, the capital of the state of Karnataka, and I flew you about 15 minutes west over what are called the Western Ghats, which is the southwestern chain of Precambrian hills that that skirt the edge of India. And let's say I dropped you out of the plane, which would be very rude, but let's say we did this. Assuming you landed safely, but randomly, you'd find yourself in a mixed forest landscape filled with native floral diversity, a lot of forest cover, complex, biodiverse mixes and patches of forest and open grassland. And you'd see an enormous amount of biodiversity. I choose mammal here, but avian diversity, that is birds, are teeming. This is the bird capital, essentially, of India, an enormous range of biodiversity. But if you looked at your feet, statistically speaking, you would most likely see that. of all the things that you could see, that is statistically most likely what you'd see, which is coffee, which is a cultivar. And you're on private land. More likely as not, you are not in a wildlife sanctuary, as I'll show you from some maps, which means that all of this biodiversity is governed, as I said before, by human decisions. And that causes us a lot of hope and a lot of despair. I'll start with despair. Despair, people can make terrible choices, choices that are extremely bad for habitat, for native and endemic biodiversity, especially for rare and endangered species. On the other hand, if people make good decisions, people can be an engine for the protection, maintenance, and expansion of native habitat, leading to biodiversity. And that's what generated the study I am describing here now. This is a National Science Foundation funded study, an NSF funded study, but I have to credit my co-authors on the study, my co-PIs, Dr. Kriti Karanth, who is at the Center for Wildlife Studies in Bangalore, and Dr. Ashwini Chaudhary, who's at the Institute for Public Policy at the Indian School of Business. The three of us wanted to untangle how to explain and therefore protect biodiversity in this sensitive region. And to give you a feeling for it, this must be very common in Thailand. This is a place where animals and people live amongst one another. This is a tea plantation. We did not study tea, but of course this is an unquestionably with me here. I'm going to keep moving as quickly as I can in case we break down again. The point here is that most of the area, this is the Western Ghats in Southwest India, as you can see here, are not wild or protected areas. They're mostly cultivated private land. That's the key thing. You can see that it is it's on the an isohyet between a heavy rainfall area and a dry area. So its physical geography makes it actually very a sense of what the landscape looks like. A very productive but very diverse landscape. All right, so what did we do? We studied areca, coffee, and rubber production. Why? Because it covers most of this landscape, which is the biodiversity hotspot of South India. And I'll say that I'm going to focus mostly on coffee, but there's a lot to say about the other two crops. The point here is it's a production landscape. It produces a lot of stuff. People are making decisions that result in biodiversity. So the diversity that you can see down here, birds and amphibians that I'll take a look at, are determined largely by the complexity, simplicity, or intensity of agrarian production, decisions that farmers make, people's priorities produce these outcomes. And those priorities are set within operational conditions and structural conditions. They've got markets, they've got co-ops. So people's conditions set the terms of their decisions. Their decisions determine the intensity of their production. That sets the terms of biodiversity. If we want to save 1 million species, which we do, we need to understand how people make decisions. We studied roughly 180 farms for their biodiversity throughout the region. I'm going to focus on the coffee production area, which you can see is in red there in these areas of Chikmagalur, Hassan, and Kodagu districts. We're interested in other kinds of production, but I'm just going to focus on coffee. And we did very traditional quantitative conservation biology assessments of the diversity that we see here. If I had it to do again, I would do it with bioacoustics instead of sending people out to the field. I would do it with microphones, which can be done now. But for now, this is a kind of old school approach, which means morning and evening counts during the dry season. around 200-meter distance to replicated 5 times at each site, which simply means counting birds, okay? And what did we find? A huge amount of biodiversity in coffee landscapes. Our interns and our volunteers were able to count and assess an enormous amount of forest biodiversity while taking certain kinds of standardized measures to make sure we were controlling for other variables. So what do you see? You see a lot of birds, right? Some of them are ubiquitous that you'd expect to find. Some of them are quite rare. The racket-tailed drongo, for example, extremely rare. More endemic, predictable species like the hill myna, absolutely expected. Other species like the hornbill, which I don't have a photo of here, very, very rare. So these are on coffee plantations. I'm just trying to remind everybody that these are in places where people live and work. The Asian paradise flycatcher. So what do we find? A lot of birds. In other words, there's biodiversity, but it varies. And that's the key. I'll come back to the qualitative human geography part of this. It varies enormously. So on one person's farm, there'll be a lot of birds. And on another person's farm, there'll be very few birds. On the whole, coffee performs very well. There's about 137 resident species, is comparable to protected areas, comparable to national parks in the region, which I think is the key point, is that if people are making the right decisions, they're going to maintain a lot of biodiversity, a huge amount. Does it correlate with? It correlates with keeping trees on your land. If you just do the land assessment, what you find is that if farmers choose to keep lots of trees and a wide diversity of trees, they're going to have birds, which is not very surprising, right? So people can make decisions to maintain trees. We also assessed amphibians. It's not as important to the study, but I thought I'd show you pictures of frogs because they're cool. These have to be sampled during the monsoon season, which is extremely difficult, which is why we have graduate students. Remember, you do these at a 45-degree hill slope in the middle of the night, in the middle of the rain. So this is very hard work to actually do the biogeography and sampling here. We found some extremely rare species. These are all taken by our field staff at night in the rain, right? Including species with incredible adaptive capacity. This is a leaping frog, for example. Those that can control their surface moisture through their adaptive ability to secrete mucus. The smallest frog in South Asia, we found these teeming in pools around coffee plantations. This species was only rediscovered in 2000. We found it in our night surveys. And this one is critically endangered and was only new to science 10 years ago. So the biodiversity part of this, and I'm going to get to the human geography part of this, is that you can maintain biodiversity by maintaining your land in a particular way, by maintaining a high level of tree species diversity. And with avian diversity, I won't go into the frogs. It's really the number and kinds of trees that you keep on your land. So now you got a puzzle. Why do people either get rid of the trees on their land, or more strangely, why do some people keep them? And at that point, you're in a decision space that requires a much more qualitative approach, at least initially, to decision making. So you can see the difference between canopy cover between these two plantations. These are very near one another. So somebody decided to coppice the trees there on the left over here, whereas somebody on the right chose to maintain the tree cover, at least in a certain level of density. Why? Why is that? It's actually kind of a puzzling question, and it's not easy to answer. And the other difference is not just the amount of tree cover, but the kinds of trees. On the right, what you see is a farm with lots of silver oak, which is a tree species introduced in the colonial era. It's nice and straight. It makes good timber. You can see why you'd only want that. But look at the one on the bottom left. That's got a lot of endemic biodiversity. That farmer is keeping trees on their land from native diversity that is indigenous to the regions and endemic biodiversity. Why? Why would one do one thing and one do the other? So we know avian diversity responds to tree diversity. The question is, what does tree diversity respond to? We talked to 344 plantation owners of coffee plantations in the region. And we tried to get, initially we just went door to door, sat and had coffee and tried to understand, listen, and learn from the farmers so that they could unleash the secrets of their production. What we learned is they keep a lot of trees. So we began to enumerate the trees that they kept on their land after long conversations. What you're seeing here is simply a list of all the species, tree species that might appear on somebody's land. And while silver oak that I mentioned before, this sort of colonial remnant, is everywhere, there are a lot of very rare and important trees down in the bottom of this table that people told us about. They kept them for fruit, they kept them because their father planted them, they kept them because they were on the land. As you get down to these rarer species at the bottom of the table, what you're seeing is habitat, and habitat produces biodiversity. So in other words, there are a number of farmers, and they are in the minority, who are maintaining a diversity of tree species on their land, which maintains a species of avian diversity. So the first thing we did is we tried to figure out whether this was something that they were taught. Was this something they learned in school? What you see on is a range of educational backgrounds. The guy on the bottom right, for example, has a master's degree in agronomy. The guy over on the left does not have a grade school graduation. They have very highly variable levels of education, even though they're all plantation owners. And the answer is education doesn't matter. We went door to door, we talked to lots of people. Very well educated producers keep sometimes very low levels of diversity and vice versa. There is no correlation that we could determine between somebody's training and their interest in maintaining biodiversity on their land. That is tree species biodiversity, which maintains avian biodiversity. So what's going on? If it's not education and they're taught to do the right thing, I mean, I'm an environmental educator. I thought environmental education would matter. I don't think it does. I think what matters is different. The second thing we looked at after that is the economic pressure to grow different varieties of coffee. What you see here is a graph just over the period between 2008 and 2013 of the price difference between two different coffee varieties, Arabica and Robusta. Why does this matter to us? Arabica, which you see as the dark line on top, is the variety that requires more shade and therefore more trees. Whereas Robusta coffee on the bottom requires less shade and in fact thrives more in the sun. So if the price difference between Arabica and Robusta changes, that is Arabica falls closer to the price of Robusta coffee, you would expect that people would take out their trees. That, in other words, there's no incentive to keep trees. So we thought it might respond to the price difference. But we talked to the farmers and none of them qualitatively were responding to variations in the market. That isn't to say that some of them haven't taken out Arabica and put in Robusta coffee, but for the most part, over the last 10 years, there's been very little change in what people were growing, despite changes in price in the market. So education, the market, so we don't know what's going on. So we go back to the farmers and we speak to them again. And what we learn is that while Arabica has the highest tree diversity and bigger plantations have more tree diversity, we still don't know what it is that causes people to do these things. So again, we sit with the farmers qualitatively, long conversations over coffee, trying to understand what they're doing, respecting their knowledge, their history, and their history of their family on the land. And the answer that they gave us in the end that turned out to be the most compelling, and I'll kind of come to my conclusions with this, is labor. All of them said the same thing. They all say different things, but the one thing that they all said in common was this. They said that workers work less hard now. This is very typical in agriculture. For those of you who work in agricultural geography, there are complaints by producers here in Wisconsin that people don't work as hard as they used to. That's categorically not true. People work just as hard now as they used to. The point that the farmers are making is that workers have a great deal more leverage than they used to. And by leverage, I mean, if they don't want to work, they can move to the city and have an alternative job. If they don't want to live on the land, they can live in the village nearby. 60% of these farms have a resident workforce, many of them living under conditions without electricity. You can well imagine that workers would want to live somewhere else. I certainly defend their right to do so. But for the farmers, the problem is this is becoming more common. Workers have more choices. If workers have more choices, and let me be clear on this, it means that labor-intensive activities become more expensive. Labor-intensive activities include the management of diverse tree species. If labor becomes more scarce, more expensive, and it becomes more expensive to maintain diverse tree species, it's more likely that a farmer will take them out. If a farmer takes them out, there's a decline in avian biodiversity. So saving species in the Anthropocene for the next 100 years depends not only on farmers' decisions, we learned by talking to them, but on the decisions of the workforce, of the rural poor, who are migrating to cities in large numbers. Now we can go back and then quantitatively assess labor force participation, wage rates. There's quantitative analyses that we can do, but none of this would have been available to us without high levels of local, calm, respectful, qualitative research that requires a great deal of listening to farmer producers. Farmer producers, some of whom are richer, some of whom are poor, some of whom speak multiple languages, some of whom only speak local dialects. It is an intensive, difficult, and crucial part of any research into even the basics of physical geography. If you do not have a team that is prepared to assess people's priorities, decision-making, culture, and economics, you're going to be unable to assess basic decisions. And that could be decisions that are relevant for climate change, biodiversity, or water quality. You can't do physical geography, in other words, without doing human geography. And you can't do human geography without taking the pulse qualitatively of the relevant stakeholders in a decision framework. I'll close here just by hammering on this finding that is relevant here. 63% of the coffee plantations had permanent labor. That means people who lived on the land. Those people are fleeing in droves. They have no interest in living on coffee plantations anymore and are moving not just to the city, but elsewhere. And this is just a little vignette here to show you how intensive arecanut cultivation is. For those of you who know, arecanut may be grown in. This fellow is harvesting arecanut. He'll climb up in the morning, he'll swing from tree to tree, harvesting arecanut, knocking it down here where it can be picked up by the other parts of the workforce. This is labor-intensive work. These people have to be paid for it. If they don't feel like coming to work, which I can well imagine they wouldn't, this crop doesn't get harvested. So labor, what I'm saying is that labor matters enormously to smallholders because they largely self-exploit. They have to do the work themselves, and to large holders because they have to hire very large numbers of workers. And the truth is, and this is just to give you a sense of the wage rate, what you're seeing here is wages on the lower line climbing, and the number of people who are actually in the rural labor force for coffee cultivation leveling off. In other words, there's an absolute labor scarcity, which is pinching these folks. So a quantitative assessment, a quick quantitative sketch, supports what we're learning qualitatively by talking to farmers, which is they don't have enough workers to manage the land. And the truth is, most of those workers haven't been born. Karnataka's fertility rate has been under 2 for two generations, maybe 3. The entire rural population has leveled off. There just isn't an excess labor pool that there used to be two or 3 generations ago. Even when I started working in India in 1990, the fertility rate in Karnataka was already low. Now it's below 2. And I think I'll close with this. I think labor scarcity is probably the most important ecological factor, human labor scarcity, the most important ecological factor of the next century. I think the absence of people from the landscape is going to make huge differences in the way ecosystems function. And our insight into this, I got to tell you, we never mentioned any of this in our NSF grant because we didn't predict it. It was literally a surprise that came out of being on the land and talking to the farmers about what makes them do what they do. So to summarize, and here's the total fertility rate there in Karnataka, well under 2. Where I've worked traditionally in northern India, it's still a little bit higher. It's still a 3 or whatever, but there's a massive demographic shift going on, and that affects people's decisions qualitatively and in terms of how they manage the land. And that in the future of biodiversity, whether there's going to be wildlife or not. In South Asia, we can create all kinds of national parks and we can do a bunch of other things, but in the end, in my opinion, based on the research, what farmers do is what matters the most, and what farmers do depends on what workers do. And I think we need to pay more attention to the rural workforce. Who are the workers and what are they willing to do? Makes a huge difference in terms of the future of the planet. So I'll maybe stop there. Ian? Oh, also we started a coffee brand that's wildlife friendly. So if anybody wants to buy it, Wild Copy is sold in India. For those who would like to buy it, this is wildlife friendly coffee based on our assessment of biodiversity on these coffee landscapes. And that's it. I'll stop sharing. Ian, is that okay?
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I think this is a very relevant topic for geographers in Thailand, because I think in many ways Thailand has experienced very similar kinds of birth rates decline very significantly. And I think that one of the main points that you've made is that to understand the changes that are occurring, we need to both look at there and where they're living. And we also need to, more importantly, understand the types of owners. Could do a very similar study like this in Thailand, and it would be very, very relevant to the situation there. So I won't speak for too much. I'd like to open things up for questions from the audience and see what people have to say. Would anyone like to start off with any questions or comments? Okay, we have a couple of hands up. The first person is Aria. Could you ask your question?
Yes. Thank you very much for this presentation. It's really, really eye-opening, and I learned a lot as well. And it's so eye-opening, and I find some interesting questions. But first, I really love the photos of all the amphibians and birds as well. And so my questions are up to you. One is that what was the change in questions when you pay more attention to the farmers, like their stories? Because I feel like you have gone back at least 2 or 3 times to understand this. Was it much longer? Is it because of the issue of trust, or the issue of language, or just different ways of asking? That's wild coffee. Is it because are these farmers already like in the wildlife project with the coffee plantations or organic practice already or not? And the third, more of like what I think next is that in Thailand we also have similar issues, but in Thailand context now I think of like, what about like women decisions and also migrant laborers, because now we also rely a lot on migrant laborers from our neighboring countries. And also with urban agriculture today, we have a lot more people working in urban agriculture to like feed food security, but we also have this problem that the workforce, they don't want to work in farms, whether in rural or urban areas. So these are more of like the questions that I gained from listening to you, and I would think of more of next research. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you. I love the bird pictures too, taken by our staff. Now, remember, I'm working with conservation biologists who take those photos. I've got some good bird photos. 1 or 2 of those are mine, but most of those are because we work in a collaboration with Indian conservation scientists, which is hugely important. So this is relevant to some of your later questions. I have some of these conversations with farmers. I sit with farmers. But a lot of this work is done by our field staff who are themselves from Karnataka. The most important thing I can say is that the next generation of people doing this research will be from Karnataka. They won't be from Wisconsin. And that I think is great. That's how it should be. Literally decolonizing the research process. So a lot of this is happening with Karnatakans speaking to Karnatakans, which we'll come to a later point. So you got 5 questions as I count them. 1, the change in the questions. Yes. So we did not set out to ask questions about labor. Only by doing the research did questions about labor come. And because we designed the research poorly, when it comes time to do 300 interviews, which are more quantitative, that is surveys, we don't have good questions about labor. So we designed the survey in advance of what we knew, which was a mistake. Don't do it. Do the qualitative work that allows you to build the survey that will yield the most productive, useful results. So I would say I learned a lesson, which is don't jump in with both feet before you know what you're doing. And if I had to do the survey again, it would be totally different. So that's the first thing, is the questions did change. We started talking a lot more about labor late in the project. And in the beginning, we almost said nothing about it. And that's the importance of that intervening work. 2, wild coffee. That is not I have no stake in that coffee company, by the way, just for the record. Conflict of interest, I don't make any money, nothing. Were the farmers interested in wildlife? Yes, that's another qualitative question that we need to get at. To what degree do they really care about the wildlife? And some of them really value it a lot, and some of them don't care at all. I don't think that matters as long as they can get Arabica coffee receipts, that is returns on their investment, that are high. And that is what my colleague Kriti Karanth believes. So she started that label as a kind of coffee cooperative. I haven't written anything on that, but that's a product of her work. She knows those farmers, and that brings us to number 3. Who's making the decision in this family? 90% of the people we spoke to, 95% of the people we spoke to were men. That doesn't mean they were actually the decision makers. The family dynamics in these households are extremely complicated. And this was not a very gender smart research project. I think if I were to do it again, I think we'd have to look very carefully at what's happening inside these households, which again would take some qualitative work first before we ever tried to roll out a larger survey, because women are making really crucial agrarian decisions throughout South Asia, right? The places I work, or some of my students work in the northern part of the country, there's been so much male labor migration that the women are the only people left making decisions. Whole villages, decisions made by women. So how does that matter? Probably a lot. I won't pretend to understand it, but I want to acknowledge it. And I think it's an excellent question, by the way. And if you would like to come to South India and do this work, you're most welcome, because we need somebody who is willing to ask that question. Urban agriculture, not part of this study, but I will tell you that it's a huge phenomenon in southern India, urban dairying even, and milk production. So there's a lot going on there. Coming back to the question of whether or not people want to work, I believe that labor scarcity is the most important question of the next century throughout the entire world, from Wisconsin to Karnataka to Thailand. I believe that workers will not do what they used to do, and I commend them for it, which I mean, is probably going to result in a high levels of automation of production. I believe that robotics, I believe that farm technologies are going to take off in a radical way in the next 25 years, because workers do not want to do this work, and I cannot blame them. So labor exploitation and the rural labor force and automation have really piqued my interest. In Wisconsin, we no longer have hand dairies. Basically, robots have taken over almost all milk production. Not all, a vast majority of milk production. And that has to do with labor scarcity. Much of that labor was migrant labor. Much of that labor was illegal labor. And all of that labor was grossly and violently exploited. And it's gone. And that leaves us with robots, which strikes me as the future of geography. So that's your 5 questions.
Okay, thank you. Pao Tai, I see your hand up as well. Do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you so much for the impressive presentation. I'm so amazed with the link between the quantitative and the qualitative work that you have presented. So I just would like to ask a short question about the effort of local communities or related organizations in maintaining biodiversity after out-migration of local farmers. Does the Indian government or other related stakeholders, right, like NGO or like civil society, put their efforts in like maintaining biodiversity in that area instead of local people? Thank you so much.
That's a great question. So I'm not an expert. I know I was brought here to be an expert, but my colleague Kriti Karanth works for the Center for Wildlife Studies in Karnataka. That's our partner organization who does a lot of this research. They are dedicated to biodiversity, and they're dedicated to working with farmers. The government, conversely, is still, if I can be bold, stuck in the protected areas model, which means that the government is extremely interested in protecting specific zones that they control. Now, those are very important. You cannot have tigers. This is an area of very successful tiger reserves, unless you have those protected areas. So the government is focusing on a very small, less than 12% of the land, small numbers of areas where they can protect really important species. I commend them. That is the state's prerogative, but they have very little interest in the communities and the agrarian producers. So it's fallen to NGOs and not-for-profits who are more keyed into the relationship between biodiversity and production. which is the area, of course, I'm most interested in. So that's where the NGOs are really playing a really crucial role, because the state, maybe because of its limited capacity, maybe because it's got an antiquated idea of conservation, maybe because of the political economy of state governance and forestry. For whatever reason, the state has relegated itself to a specific role in conservation, which is areas that it controls, which, having studied the history of Indian forestry, I can tell you is not surprising. But there's a huge role for the not-for-profit sector to step in that area between the city and the protected area, which is filled with biodiversity. Those areas that are not controlled by the state, but could be influenced by incentivizing farmers to keep trees on their land, paying a universal basic income, which is something that India is experimenting with, which also causes a labor shortage. And working with farmers to produce these outcomes. So, I mean, my quick answer is that the role for NGOs is exactly in India. I can't speak for Thailand. In India, this is exactly where they can be most effective, because the state does an okay job with tiger, not always. Sometimes they do a terrible job with tiger reserves, but let's pretend for a moment that they do a great job with tiger reserves. That still leaves 80% of the land in one of the greatest biodiversity hotspots in the globe under the major influence of private landowners. And if NGOs aren't working there, then nobody's working there. So I see real opportunities there. I am skeptical of the market solution that my colleague Kriti came up with, Wild Coffee, the biodiverse friendly coffee. It's a good effort. I salute her. I think, I tell you, if you want workers on the land, if you want worker intensive production, I would just subsidize rural healthcare much better than Karnataka does. Right now, rural healthcare in Karnataka is terrible relative to Kerala, its neighboring state. People would be much less likely to move into terrible urban conditions if they knew their kids had a decent school and decent healthcare. So my feeling is, if you want to be radical, and you want to save biodiversity, you build more rural clinics for poor people. That's sort of my answer. And that's where the not-for-profit sector really needs to advocate and push hard. But in the end, the government will have to build those clinics. Does that help? Does that answer the question?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, that helps a lot.
Okay.
Thank you.
This is hard on Zoom. You know, you can't see anybody's faces. You don't know if you're connecting. I'm just talking into a box. It's very difficult.
Do we have other questions or comments? Maybe while we're waiting, oh, actually, okay. Chaya has his hand up. I'll ask Chaya, please ask your question.
Hello, Professor Paul Robbins. Thank you very, very much for your talk. I learned a lot from your research, starting from quantitative through to qualitative studies. And I'd like to ask more about the process of working with your team members who are from different disciplines. And you told me that along the journey of your research, at the start, maybe you didn't design your research very well, and then you made changes, you went back, and then you found the crucial part on the qualitative studies. My question is it because you were trained as a geographer, and so you see the gaps and mistakes along the way, and did other members of your team envision the research in the same way that you did? And what kind of agreements or disagreements did you solve along the way until you reached the outcome of your research? Thank you.
That's a really great question. There's a lot there, and thank you for it. We would have to sit over a lot of cups of coffee to get to the end of that. But what you signaled is that it can be a fraught process. I'm very lucky. I have very good colleagues. And we all began this adventure, Ashwini and Kriti and I, in a Jeep. And we drove through the landscape. So this is the geographer in me. If you have a common problem and a place in mind, and you spend enough time in a Jeep together, you begin to come to some common understandings. Research is a human process. If you're really in the place and you're in the Jeep together for hours, and I was so jet lagged and I would fall asleep periodically. And if you're on these landscapes and you're talking to these farmers and you're together, and then you get back in the Jeep and you say, all right, what did we just hear? What did we just see? That is the geographer's craft. I don't know, does Ashwini, Ian, do you know Ashwini Chatri?
Well, yeah, he was at Urbana.
He has a geography degree, doesn't he?
Wasn't he in Illinois before? Illinois?
Yeah, he was. Yeah.
Yeah, I knew him when he was there. Yeah.
I think he's got a geography degree. Kriti does.
Oh,
not.
he was in geography then. He has a he was
he's at the Indian School of
Department
now, so he has a kind of geographic temperament that helps. It's nice when you've got more than one geographer in the room. Kriti is a conservation biologist. Her dad is Ulas Karant, the famous tiger saver. That guy doesn't like people at all. So there's a learning that goes on when the three people are in the Jeep. So I guess what I would say is that very early on, we established a very productive rapport that would allow us to be surprised, that would allow us to change our methodology as we went, that would allow us to learn as we go. And that was because the people were good, but really it's because everybody was in the Jeep. You've got to get everybody in the Jeep. That's both literal and metaphorical. Literal in the sense that actually being physically together in a place with a single problem. Remember, it's problem focused. I have a lot of theory that goes in behind this. I have peasant studies. I have like Chayanov. I got Marx. I got all kinds of theory, right? That's my business. Kriti's not interested in that. She's interested in population dynamics of birds. She's got her own theory. Both of those engines are turning. How do those engines come into conversation? We have a single problem, which is the birds here in this place. And when we share the problem, then the fact that we are operating in two different vocabularies becomes less of a problem, because we share a problem. We have a nut we have to crack, and we have to do it together. So I guess that's what I'd say. And this is something I've learned here at the Nelson Institute, you know, having left the geography department, is I'm in a place that's very focused on problem solving. Our faculty and our students are very practical. I find that sometimes problematic, but it does allow for team building, because you can always build a team around a problem. You can't build a team around a theory. You can't build a team sometimes even around a single question, but you can build a team around a problem. So I guess that's what I'd say. Place-based, collaborative, get in the Jeep. That's all I got when it comes to that.
Other questions?
I don't know if that helps, Chaya.
Or Chaya, do you want to say anything more?
Thank you very much for your advice, and I would take that and learn more from you. Thank you.
Well, I'm just learning this as I go, so frankly.
Do we have other questions, comments? Maybe while we're waiting, I would like to ask a question, Paul, which I think is really relevant for what we're trying to do with this series. And I think the point of organizing around a problem, you know, rather than a theory, is a great way to think about how geographers can collaborate, right? Because geographers do have diverse understandings. People work on quantitative issues, qualitative issues. I mean, they work in different ways, have different levels of expertise, which is really the strength of our discipline, right? Is that we have that. And how we can get people to come together to work on problem solving is really what will take advantage of our comparative position, right? And I think that thinking about, you sometimes in other places you talk about the object of concern, right? The thing that you want to look at, and I think that that's something that all geography departments and people within geography departments working in diverse issues, diverse theoretical backgrounds and specializations, can really come together. But what I really want to ask you about is surveys versus qualitative interviews, because you mentioned that what you did was you started off with a survey that wasn't as well designed as you wanted it to be, and then you moved to qualitative, in which you came to realize that the survey wasn't really designed in the way that you should have designed it. And yet, so you were sort of suggesting that you should have done things the other way around. You should have done the qualitative and then the survey afterwards. But sometimes surveys can also inform the type of qualitative work that we do. So in a project that I'm involved, we kind of tried to do the best of both worlds. We actually did qualitative research first, then we did a survey. So and then we came back and did qualitative research again, so that we tried to, the survey was informed by additional qualitative work, but then the survey helped to also inform our future qualitative work. So we kind of used the qualitative to inform the quantitative, and the quantitative to inform the qualitative. And I'm just wondering if that makes sense for what you were looking at.
Short answer is yes. I mean, it's a constant iteration. So I mean, that's the right answer. The problem is there's not all the time in the world, and there's not all the money in the world. Right. So this is the biggest problem when it comes to research, is how much time have you got? How much money have you got? How much labor do you have to make those things happen? But yeah, we did start with qualitative work that informed the quantitative work that turned out to come up short, that we went back and did qualitative work. But then the project ended, and we were left with the findings we had, and we had to return our findings to the farmers who wanted to know about their bird diversity, by the way, which is a huge part I didn't mention, which is we returned all the bird diversity data to the farmers we interviewed. A lot of them run what's called homestays. I don't know what to call them in Thailand, but it's basically bed and breakfast. They really want to know what birds are on their land. That was why they agreed to the study. That ate up a huge amount of time. In the end, Ian, the problem is these things are incredibly complicated, and you could study them to death. So how can you be efficient with the labor time and the patience of your respondents? You don't want to go back to them 12 times. The people don't want to be studied. They want what you can support them with. So the answer is yes, you're absolutely right. It needs to be iterative, back and forth. But if you get it right the first time, then you don't have to do it 10 times.
Yeah, and by the way, they call them homestays in Thailand as well. So that, I'm sure everyone understands what homestays are. So thanks. Thanks, Paul. Other questions or comments?
Yes, can I ask some question?
Yes, please, Jip.
Yeah, so in my hometown, we have a lot of durian plantation, and we also have the same problem as in the region in India too. So we don't have enough labor, and durian is still like a cash crop for people in my hometown too. So what happened is the owner just sell the land to the Chinese investor instead, because the Chinese investor can pay a lot of money to buy the land. And then the Chinese just hire migrant workers to work in the land instead. So I would like to ask that, would this might happen to what this might happen in the region in India too. And have you ever heard any local people when you interview that they mention about selling the land or what they're gonna do with the land if they don't have labor to work on the plantation? This is my question.
I'm afraid we may have lost Paul again. I don't see him there now. He seems to have had another problem with internet connectivity. Let's just wait a minute till he comes back, hopefully. Because I don't see him on now. He seems to have just disappeared at the time your question was being asked. Usually we have pretty good connectivity here, especially very early in the morning, because you know it's only.
He's back.
Okay. Back
Sorry,
again.
I'm going to sign off. I've got to make breakfast and get, for my son and get him to school. I have a 5-year-old. So if there's one last question, I'll take it.
Yeah. Okay, Jim, why don't you ask your question again? Since you already.
So yes, like I would like to hear, like when you go to the interviews, have you heard any local people mention about selling the land to the foreign investor or like any investor, and what they want to do if they cannot find any labor to work on the plantation?
That's a great question. I want to go back and look at that. At the time that we were there, it's an excellent question. In the time we were there hadn't been a land sale in at least a decade. Over that entire 3 districts, people do not want to part with the land. The land, you know, was their father's. They do not want to part with the land. So there's a very conservative sense of not selling the land. That was at the time we were there. Also, it's not a very attractive investment for foreign investors. It's one thing to come in as a mining company, go to a big state forest and destroy the ecosystem. That's cheap. Running a coffee plantation is hard. I come from peasant studies, and there's one lesson from peasant studies is that capitalists don't want to farm. They leave that to peasants. They buy the goods and then, you know, market them as commodities and, you know, operate in a capitalist market, but they don't want, capitalists don't want to farm. And that's true of coffee. We also noticed that there were not big buyers for coffee. There were lots of traders that went through a lot of markets. So we're not seeing a lot of land sales. Now, there have been some farmer suicides in the region since we completed the study, I was told. So there may be some land transition that's occurring. You know, once you lose the owner, what happens to the land is a little unclear. So there may be some transitions, but I gotta say, my experience in India is people are loath to let go of the land. And that's still true to a great degree. Where I see large levels of land acquisition, it's in the peri-urban areas for industrial and suburban development, which will Karnataka in coffee country, hill slopes. They're not going to turn it into a city. There's nothing to mine. People don't want to buy coffee plantations. They're very risky. Tourism is probably the most dangerous predator lurking out there in the forest because it's beautiful country. I can imagine a lot of money coming in around tourist development, and those coffee plantation folks might sell if they had a big buyer, but still the market's pretty calm. It's a great question. There's another dissertation in the region we worked. There's 3 dissertations in the region we worked, and one of them I think would be around this question of land acquisition and sale.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
And by the way, Paul, Puttapan, who just asked the question, she got her PhD at UW-Madison, graduated last year.
In geography?
In geography.
We never met. Did we meet?
Yeah, now she's back as a professor at Chulalongkorn University.
Congratulations. I I hope your UW education serves you well.
Thank you. It's good. Very good. Very well.
Okay, so as Paul mentioned, he's got a young boy that he's got to get and make breakfast for before sending him off to school. So let's join us in thanking Paul for his time today and for getting up so early in the morning to give us this talk. And I think it's a very important talk for thinking about geography in Thailand. And there are many, many parallels between what he's been talking about in India, I think, and what's happening in Thailand. So so thank you, Paul. And everyone, please give us our virtual clapping or whatever you want to do to thank Paul for his time.
Enormous pleasure. Thank you all very, very much. Good luck in your work. Best wishes to you all. I gotta go make breakfast. See you.